The cold air at 20,000 feet felt like knives against Jack Morrison's face. He sat behind his .50 caliber machine gun, watching the sky through the small window of the B-17 bomber. It was March 1942, and this was his 8th mission over Germany. 7 times he had returned to base. 7 times he had seen friends die. Below them, the German city of Bremen burned. American bombers had just dropped their payload. Now came the dangerous part. The flight back home. This was when the enemy fighters always came. Jack's hands shook as he gripped his gun. Not from fear, from the cold. At least that is what he told himself. Through his headset, he heard the pilot's voice crack with static. Bandits at 3 o'clock. Here they come. Jack turned his gun to the right. There they were. 5 Messerschmitt fighters. Black dots growing larger every second. They moved so fast, faster than anything Jack had ever seen on the ground. The German pilots were good. Very good. They had been fighting since 1939. The Americans were new to this war. The first fighter came straight at them. Jack could see the pilot's face for just a moment. Then he pressed the trigger. The gun roared. Hot shells flew past his arm. He aimed right at the cockpit, right at the German pilot. He was sure he would hit, but nothing happened. The Messerschmitt rolled away untouched. Its guns flashed. Jack heard metal tear somewhere behind him. Someone screamed on the radio. Another fighter came from below. Jack swung his gun down. He aimed carefully. Right at the engine. Right at the center of the plane. He fired again. 50 rounds, maybe more. The tracers showed him where his bullets went. They looked perfect. They looked like they should hit. The German plane flew away without a scratch. Jack wanted to scream. How was this possible? He was aiming right at them. The other gunners were shooting too. The sky was full of bullets. Thousands of rounds, but the enemy fighters danced through it all like ghosts. 2 hours later, they landed back in England. Jack climbed out of the bomber and counted. 3 planes from their group did not come back. 30 men, gone. Just like that. In the debriefing room, the intelligence officer asked the same questions he always asked. Did you hit any enemy aircraft? How many did you shoot down? What were their tactics? Jack and the other gunners gave the same answers they always gave. They had aimed perfectly. They had fired at the right time. They had done everything by the book. But nothing worked. The Germans just kept flying. I don't understand it, sir, said Tommy Chen, another gunner from Jack's squadron. I know I hit that fighter. I saw my tracers go right through where he was. But he just kept coming. The officer made notes. He looked tired. Everyone looked tired. This was happening everywhere. American bombers were getting destroyed over Europe. The gunners were brave. They were willing to die. But bravery did not matter when your bullets could not hit anything. That night in the barracks, Jack lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Tomorrow they would fly again. Tomorrow more men would die, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Hey, Jack, whispered Billy Foster from the next bunk. You think we're gonna make it? Jack did not answer. The statistics said no. The average bomber crew lasted 5 missions. Jack had already flown 8. He was living on borrowed time. My dad was in the last war, Billy continued. He said it was nothing like this. They could see the enemy. They could hit what they aimed at. This is different. It's like fighting shadows, Jack finally spoke. The brass will figure something out. They have to. But he did not believe his own words. How could anyone figure this out? The problem was simple. The Germans were faster, more experienced, better trained. American gunners were shooting their hearts out and hitting nothing but air. Across the base, in a small office that smelled of cigarette smoke and old coffee, Colonel Robert Barnes read the latest casualty reports. Last month, they lost 42 bombers. This month looked worse. Much worse. The numbers were clear. At this rate, they would run out of crews before they ran out of planes. Barnes had fought in World War I. He knew what death looked like. But this was different. In the trenches, you could shoot back. You could dig in. Here his boys were sitting ducks at 20,000 feet, flying in straight lines. Easy targets. Someone knocked on his door. A young lieutenant entered with more bad news. Another training accident. A gunner had been killed practicing on ground targets. Even on the ground, something was wrong. The men could not hit moving targets. Not in the air. Not even in practice. Barnes dismissed the lieutenant and walked to his window. Outside, mechanics worked on damaged bombers. Every plane had bullet holes. But those bullet holes came from German guns. German guns that seemed to hit their targets just fine. Why could the Germans hit American planes, but American gunners could not hit German planes? Both sides had guns. Both sides had bullets. What was the difference? Barnes did not know. But somewhere someone had to figure it out. Before it was too late. Before they lost this war in the sky above Europe. The night was quiet except for the sound of engines. Another mission was being prepared. More boys would fly into the dawn. More boys would probably die. And nobody knew how to stop it. Dr. Philip Chen had never wanted to be part of a war. He was a mathematics professor at Columbia University. His world was numbers, equations, and theories, not bullets and blood. But in April 1942, the United States military came knocking. They needed help. Desperate help. Philip sat in a small room at Wright Field in Ohio. The Army Air Force had brought him here to solve a problem. A deadly problem. Across the table sat 3 officers who looked like they had not slept in weeks. "Dr. Chen, our boys are dying," said the oldest officer, a general with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes. "We're shooting thousands of rounds at enemy aircraft. We're hitting nothing. The Germans are shooting us down like clay pigeons." Philip adjusted his glasses. He was 32 years old, thin, quiet. Nothing about him looked like a soldier. The officers seemed unsure about him. A Chinese-American professor. Could he really help win a war? "Show me the combat footage," Philip said simply. For the next 3 hours, Philip watched grainy films of aerial combat. German fighters attacking American bombers. American gunners firing back, tracers lighting up the sky, and almost no hits. The footage was frustrating. The gunners seemed to aim perfectly, but the bullets always missed. Philip asked to watch one particular clip again, and again, and again, 12 times total. The officers grew impatient. "Doctor, we've all seen these films 100 times. What are you looking for?" Philip pointed at the screen. "Watch the tracers. Watch where they go. Now watch where the German plane is when the gunner fires. Now watch where the German plane is 1 second later." The officers leaned forward. Suddenly one of them gasped. "The plane moves," he whispered. "Exactly," Philip said. "A Messerschmitt 109 flies at roughly 300 miles per hour. That is 440 feet per second. Your 50 caliber bullets travel at roughly 2,900 feet per second. At a range of 1,000 feet, the bullet takes about 1/3 of a second to reach the target. In that 1/3 of a second, the German plane travels almost 150 feet. The room went silent. Philip continued. "Your gunners are not missing. They are hitting exactly where they aim. The problem is they are aiming at where the plane is, not where the plane will be." The general stood up. His face was red. "Are you telling me my men have been shooting at ghosts?" "In simple terms, yes, sir. By the time the bullet arrives, the target has already moved. The gunners are shooting at empty air." Another officer spoke up. "But the Germans hit us just fine. How do they do it?" Philip had thought about this. The Germans have been at war since 1939. 3 years of combat experience. They have learned through trial and error. They aim ahead. They lead their targets. Your gunners are new. They do what seems natural. They aim directly at what they see. The general sat back down. He looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. "So what do we do? How do we fix this?" Philip pulled out a notebook. He had been working on calculations all night. "We need to teach gunners to aim ahead of the target. We need to calculate lead angles. How far ahead to aim based on target speed, range, and angle of attack. It's physics. It's mathematics. It can be taught." Over the next 2 weeks, Philip worked 20 hours a day. He calculated lead angles for every possible combat scenario. Head-on attacks, beam attacks, tail chases. Different speeds, different ranges, different angles. He created tables, charts, simple rules that gunners could learn. But when he presented his work to a group of experienced gunners, they laughed at him. "You want us to aim in front of the target?" said one sergeant with 3 missions under his belt. "That's insane. That's like throwing a baseball behind a runner." "Actually," Philip said quietly, "when you throw to first base, you aim ahead of where the runner will be. You lead him. That's different. That's on the ground. In the air, everything moves faster. Your math might work on paper, Professor. But up there, when a Messerschmitt is coming at you at 300 miles per hour, you don't have time to think. You just shoot. Philip understood their doubt. These men were fighting for their lives. They trusted their instincts. And their instincts told them to aim at what they saw. Asking them to aim at empty sky felt wrong, felt dangerous. But Philip knew his math was correct. The problem was proving it. He needed a test. A real test with real gunners and real targets. He went to Colonel Barnes. Barnes was different from the other officers. He listened. He asked questions. He did not dismiss ideas just because they seemed strange. "Colonel, I need access to a bombing range. I need moving targets. I need gunners willing to try something new." Barnes looked at the calculations. He was not a mathematician, but he understood enough. The logic made sense. "This could work, Doctor. But if it doesn't, I'm risking men's lives on a theory." "You're already risking men's lives, Colonel. Right now, your gunners have almost zero chance of hitting a fast-moving fighter. My method might not be perfect, but it has to be better than what you're doing now." Barnes made a decision. "You'll have your test. But Dr. Chen, if this fails, there won't be a second chance. The brass is already skeptical of bringing in civilian scientists. Don't make me regret this." Philip spent 3 days at the gunnery range with 6 volunteer gunners. They practiced on trucks fitted with wooden targets, driving past at high speeds. At first, the gunners missed everything. Aiming ahead felt completely wrong. Their instincts screamed at them to aim at the target, not in front of it. But slowly, something changed. After 50 practice rounds, one gunner hit a moving target. Then another. By the 3rd day, all 6 gunners were hitting moving targets more than half the time. It was working. The lead gunner, a tough sergeant named Mike Powers, approached Philip. "Professor, I didn't believe you. I thought you were just another pencil pusher who never saw combat. But this works. This really works." Philip felt relief wash over him. But the real test was still ahead. Ground targets were one thing. Enemy fighters at 20,000 feet were another. Could this work in real combat? Barnes scheduled a meeting with his superiors. Philip would present his findings to a room full of generals and colonels. Men who had spent their entire careers in the military. Men who did not like being told they were doing things wrong by a civilian professor. The night before the meeting, Philip barely slept. He reviewed his calculations again and again. The math was solid. The test results were promising. But would it be enough? Would they listen? Or would they send him back to his university, while more men died in the sky above Europe? Tomorrow would decide everything. The conference room at Wright Field smelled of cigars and stale coffee. 15 high-ranking officers sat around a long wooden table. Maps of Europe covered the walls. Each red pin marked a location where American bombers had been shot down. There were too many red pins. Philip Chen stood at the front of the room with his charts and calculations. His hands were sweating. These men had the power to save thousands of lives, or they could ignore him and send him home. Everything depended on the next 30 minutes. General Howard Mitchell entered last. He was the commander of the 8th Air Force, responsible for all American bombing operations over Europe. Everyone stood. Mitchell waved them down and took his seat. He looked at Philip with cold eyes. "Dr. Chen, I've heard you have a theory about why our gunners can't hit German fighters. You have 20 minutes. Make it count." Philip took a deep breath and began. "Gentlemen, the enemy you're fighting isn't just the Luftwaffe. You're fighting physics. You're fighting time. You're fighting an invisible enemy that nobody sees." He pointed to his first chart. "A German Messerschmitt 109 flies at 300 miles per hour. Your bullets travel at 2,900 feet per second. This seems fast, but at typical combat ranges of 1,000 feet, your bullet needs 0.34 seconds to reach the target. In that time, the enemy plane moves 147 feet. One colonel interrupted. "We know targets move, Doctor." "That's not news." "Yes, sir. But here's what you don't know. The human brain processes what it sees with a delay. When your gunner looks at an enemy fighter, what he's seeing is actually where that fighter was a fraction of a second ago, not where it is now. Add the bullet travel time, and your gunner is shooting at where the target was almost half a second ago. At combat speeds, that target is now 200 feet away from where your gunner thinks it is." The room was silent. Philip continued. "I've studied the combat footage. I've interviewed 37 gunners who survived multiple missions. Every single one describes the same thing. They aim at the enemy plane, they fire. They see their tracers go exactly where they aimed. And they miss. They think they're bad shots. They're not. They're shooting at ghosts." General Mitchell leaned forward. "So what's the solution?" Philip flipped to his next chart. Lead angles. Your gunners must aim ahead of the target. How far ahead depends on 3 factors: target speed, range, and angle of attack. I've calculated tables for every common scenario. He showed them the tables, numbers, angles, diagrams. To Philip, it was beautiful mathematics. To the officers, it looked complicated. This is too complex, said another colonel. My boys can't do calculus while a Messerschmitt is shooting at them. They don't have to, Philip replied. I've simplified it. For a beam attack at 1,000 feet, aim 6 plane lengths ahead. For a head-on attack, aim 3 plane lengths ahead. For a tail chase, aim 2 plane lengths ahead. Simple rules they can memorize. You tested this? Mitchell asked. Colonel Barnes stood up. I authorized a test last week, sir. 6 gunners, 3 days. They practiced on moving ground targets using Dr. Chen's method. Their hit rate went from 5% to 53%. Mitchell's eyebrows raised. 53%? Yes, sir. And that was after only 3 days of training. With more practice, the numbers should improve. But not everyone was convinced. An older general named Patterson spoke up. I've been in the Air Force for 23 years. We've always taught our men to aim at the target. Not in front of it, not behind it, at it. This goes against every principle of marksmanship. Philip chose his words carefully. General Patterson, with respect, those principles apply to stationary targets or slow-moving targets. They don't apply to aircraft moving at 300 miles per hour. The Germans learned this the hard way. They lost many pilots in the early years of the war. But they adapted. They learned to lead their targets. That's why they're shooting us down. That's why we're not shooting them down. Patterson's face turned red. Are you suggesting the Luftwaffe is better trained than the United States Army Air Force? I'm suggesting they have 3 more years of combat experience. They've learned lessons we're still learning. We can either learn from their experience or keep losing men while we figure it out ourselves. The tension in the room was thick. Mitchell raised his hand for silence. Dr. Chen, if we implement your system, how long before we see results? That depends on how quickly you can retrain your gunners, sir. Basic training would take 2 weeks. Advanced training another 2 weeks. Within a month, you could have squadrons using this technique in combat. And if it doesn't work? Patterson demanded. If you're wrong, we'll have wasted a month and trained our men to use a system that gets them killed. Philip met his gaze. If I'm wrong, sir, your casualties will stay the same as they are now. If I'm right, you'll start shooting down German fighters. The risk of trying is low. The risk of not trying is that this war continues with current loss rates. At current rates, you'll run out of trained crews within 18 months. The room erupted in argument. Some officers supported the idea. Others thought it was madness. Mitchell let them argue for 5 minutes, then slammed his hand on the table. Enough. Dr. Chen, you'll get your chance. Colonel Barnes, I'm authorizing a combat test. Pick 1 squadron. Train them in this method. Send them on 3 missions. If the results are positive, we'll expand the program. If the results are negative, we forget this conversation ever happened. Philip felt his heart race. This was the opportunity he needed. But it was also terrifying. Real men would fly real missions using his calculations. If he was wrong, they would die. Barnes approached him after the meeting. Doctor, I'm putting my best squadron on this. 27 men. They're scheduled to fly a mission over Bremen in 2 weeks. That gives you 14 days to teach them your system. Can you do it? I have to, Colonel. Good, because if this fails, those men won't get a second chance. Neither will you. Philip spent that night going over his calculations again. The math was solid. He was sure of it. But mathematics on paper was different from men fighting for their lives in the sky. What if there were variables he hadn't considered? What if combat stress made the technique impossible to use? He thought about the gunners he had met. Young men. Most were barely 20 years old. They trusted their commanders. If their commanders told them to aim ahead of the target, they would try. But would it feel natural enough to use in combat? Would their instincts override their training when the shooting started? Philip didn't know. All he could do was teach them the best he could, train them as thoroughly as possible in 2 weeks, and hope that when the moment came they would remember. They would trust the math. They would aim at empty sky and hit the invisible enemy that had been killing them all along. Outside his window, mechanics worked through the night preparing bombers for tomorrow's missions. Somewhere over Europe, other bombers were already in the air. Other gunners were already shooting at targets they couldn't hit. Other men were already dying. Philip looked at his watch. 13 days and 23 hours until the test. Until everything would be proven right or wrong. Until men would live or die based on his equations. He picked up his pen and started writing training materials. There was no time to waste. Jack Morrison stood with 26 other men in a freezing hangar at RAF Thurley in England. It was May 1942. Outside, rain hammered against the metal roof. Inside, Colonel Barnes was about to change everything they knew about aerial gunnery. "Gentlemen," Barnes began, "you've been selected for a special training program. For the next 2 weeks, you're going to learn a new shooting technique. It's going to feel wrong. It's going to feel impossible. But I need you to trust the process." He gestured to Philip Chen, who stood nervously to the side. Some of the gunners had heard rumors about the Chinese professor with crazy ideas. Most were skeptical. "This is Dr. Philip Chen. He's going to teach you how to actually hit enemy fighters. I know what you're thinking. You already know how to shoot, but the statistics say otherwise. Our current hit rate against German fighters is less than 2%. 2%. That's unacceptable." Barnes let that sink in. 2%. The men had known they weren't hitting much, but hearing the actual number was sobering. Philip stepped forward. He had practiced this speech 100 times. "The reason you're missing isn't because you're bad shots. It's because you're aiming at where the target is. You need to aim at where the target will be. I'm going to show you how." For the next 2 days, Philip taught them the theory: target speed, bullet velocity, lead angles. Some men understood quickly. Others struggled with the concepts. Jack Morrison was somewhere in the middle. The math made sense, but could he really use it when a Messerschmitt was coming at him with guns blazing? On the 3rd day, they started practical training. Barnes had set up a special range with trucks pulling targets at high speeds. The gunners would practice leading moving targets on the ground before trying it in the air. Jack's first attempt was a disaster. Every instinct told him to aim at the target, but Philip's voice echoed in his head. 6 plane lengths ahead for a beam attack. Jack aimed at empty space ahead of the moving target. It felt insane. He squeezed the trigger. Miss. The bullets hit behind the target. "You're still aiming too close," Philip called out. "Trust the math. Aim further ahead," Jack tried again. This time he aimed even further ahead. It felt like he was shooting at nothing. He fired. The target exploded in a shower of wood. "That's it," Philip shouted. "You hit it." Do you feel the difference? Jack did feel it. It had felt completely wrong, but it worked. He tried again. Another hit. Then another. By the end of the day, he was hitting more targets than he missed, but not everyone was progressing. Tommy Chen, the gunner Jack had flown with for months, couldn't adjust. His instincts were too strong. Every time he tried to lead the target, he pulled back at the last second and aimed directly at it. "I can't do it, Jack," Tommy said that night in the barracks. "My brain won't let me shoot at empty air. It feels like suicide." "I know," Jack replied. "But think about it. What we were doing before wasn't working. We were already shooting at empty air. We just didn't know it." After 10 days of intense training, Barnes scheduled a practice mission. They would fly a real bomber, fire at towed aerial targets, test the technique in actual flight conditions. Jack climbed into the bomber feeling nervous. The paper targets being towed by other planes would move much faster than the trucks on the ground. This would be the real test. The first target appeared. Jack swung his gun to track it. His training kicked in. He calculated the lead angle. 6 plane lengths. He aimed ahead. Way ahead, he fired. Tracers streaked through the sky. The target shredded. Over the radio, Barnes's voice crackled with excitement. "Good hit, Morrison."
"Keep it up!"
For the next hour, the squadron practiced against multiple targets. The hit rate was incredible, more than 60%, higher than anyone had expected, but the real test was still coming. In 3 days, they would fly a combat mission to Bremen, the same city where Jack had almost died 2 months ago. This time, they would face real German fighters that shot back. The night before the mission, Philip visited the barracks. He rarely talked to the men directly, but tonight he felt he had to. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I understand what I'm asking of you. I'm asking you to ignore your instincts, to trust mathematics over what your eyes tell you. That's not easy, especially when someone is trying to kill you," Jack spoke up. "Doc, we trust you. You've shown us it works. Now we just have to prove it works against real targets." German fighters are faster than practice targets, Philip said. They're more unpredictable. They're flown by men who want to live as much as you do, but the physics don't change. The math doesn't lie. Lead them, aim ahead, and you'll hit them. The men nodded. Some looked confident. Others looked terrified. Jack was both. Mission day arrived with clear skies. Perfect flying weather. Perfect fighting weather. The squadron took off at dawn. 27 men and 3 bombers. They climbed to 20,000 feet and headed for Germany. Jack checked his gun for the 10th time. The ammunition was loaded. The mechanism was clean. Everything was ready, except maybe his nerves. Over the radio, the bombardier's voice and bombs away. The payload fell toward Bremen. Now came the moment they had all been waiting for. The moment when German fighters would attack. Bandits at 2 o'clock. 4 Messerschmitts inbound. Jack's heart pounded. Here we go, he thought. Time to see if the professor's math works when people are shooting back. The first German fighter came in fast. Very fast. Jack tracked it with his gun. He calculated. Beam attack. Range about 1,000 feet. 6 plane lengths ahead, he aimed at empty sky. The Messerschmitt was nowhere near his gun sight. Every nerve in his body screamed that he was wrong, that he should aim at the plane, but he trusted the math. He squeezed the trigger. The .50 caliber roared. Tracers arced through the air. They looked like they would miss by a mile. Then the impossible happened. The German fighter flew directly into the stream of bullets. Smoke erupted from its engine. The Messerschmitt rolled over and began falling toward Earth. I got him, Jack screamed into the radio. I actually got him. All around him, other guns were firing. Other gunners were using the new technique. Another Messerschmitt took hits and broke away trailing smoke. A third fighter tried to attack from below but flew into a wall of lead. It exploded in mid-air. The remaining German fighter fled. 4 enemies engaged. 3 shot down or damaged. 1 scared away. It was the most successful defensive action the squadron had ever experienced. On the flight back to England, the radio was alive with excited voices. The men couldn't believe it. They had actually hurt the Luftwaffe. For the first time in months, they felt like they had a chance. Barnes was waiting when they landed. So was Philip. The gunners jumped out of the planes, talking over each other, describing their hits. It works, Colonel, one gunner shouted. It really works. Barnes turned to Philip. The professor looked like he might cry. All his calculations, all his theories, they had just been proven in blood and fire. Dr. Chen, Barnes said formally, I believe we need to have a conversation with General Mitchell. This technique needs to go to every squadron in the 8th Air Force. Philip nodded, unable to speak. Somewhere in the sky above Germany, a German pilot who had survived hundreds of missions was about to report something terrifying to his commanders. The Americans had learned how to shoot back. The news spread through the 8th Air Force like wildfire. One squadron had shot down 3 German fighters in a single mission. 3 confirmed kills, 2 more probables. It was unheard of, impossible, until it happened. Within a week, General Mitchell ordered the immediate retraining of every bomber gunner in England. Philip Chen's technique would become standard procedure for all American air operations in Europe. The professor who had been laughed at just weeks before was now the most important civilian in the entire air war. But Philip knew the real work was just beginning. Teaching one squadron was manageable. Teaching thousands of gunners across dozens of air bases was a massive undertaking. He would need help. The military assigned him a team of 50 instructors, combat veterans who had used the new technique successfully, men like Jack Morrison, who had proven the system worked under fire. They traveled from base to base teaching the lead angle method to every gunner they could find. Not everyone accepted it easily. Old habits died hard. Some senior officers still believed in aiming directly at the target. They had taught that method for 20 years. Changing now felt like admitting they had been wrong, but the statistics didn't lie. By July 1942, squadrons using the lead angle technique had double the kill rate of those using old methods. By August, the difference was even greater. Squadron commanders who refused to adopt the new system found themselves explaining why their casualties were so high. In Germany, the Luftwaffe noticed the change immediately. Their fighter pilots reported that American defensive fire had suddenly become much more effective. Attacks that had been easy just months before were now deadly. The Americans were no longer easy targets. Oberst Franz Weber was one of Germany's top fighter aces. He had shot down 43 Allied aircraft since 1939. In September 1942, he led an attack on a formation of B-17 bombers over Frankfurt. He expected it to be routine. It wasn't. Weber's wingman was hit on the first pass. His plane burst into flames and he bailed out. Weber couldn't understand it. The American gunner had fired ahead of his wingman, not at him, ahead of him, as if he knew exactly where the plane would be. Weber tried his own attack. He came in fast from below, a tactic that usually worked. But the American gunners led their shots perfectly. Bullets ripped through his left wing. He barely escaped. That night, Weber filed a report to his commanders. The Americans have learned to shoot. Their gunnery has improved dramatically. We can no longer attack with confidence. We must develop new tactics. The German high command was alarmed. For 3 years, the Luftwaffe had dominated the skies. Now suddenly, their pilots were afraid to attack American bombers. Something had changed, but they didn't know what. Back in England, Jack Morrison had become a minor celebrity. He was now a gunnery instructor, teaching new crews the technique that had saved his life. He had completed 35 combat missions, far more than the average. He had 14 confirmed kills, more than most fighter pilots, but success came with a price. Jack had watched too many friends die. Even with the new technique, the air war was brutal. The Germans adapted. They developed new tactics, longer range attacks, rocket weapons, anything to stay out of range of the improved American gunnery. The war wasn't over, but the balance had shifted. American bombers were no longer helpless. They could fight back. They could hurt the Luftwaffe. By December 1942, American gunners had shot down more German fighters in 6 months than in the entire previous year. The improvement was staggering. Bomber loss rates dropped by 40%. Thousands of American lives were saved. Philip Chen received no public recognition for his work. His research was classified. The military didn't want the Germans to know about the mathematical principles behind the technique. They wanted the enemy to think it was just better training or better equipment, but those who knew the truth understood Philip's contribution. Colonel Barnes, now promoted to General Barnes, made sure Philip received a private commendation. A ceremony attended by just a dozen people, no press, no publicity. "Dr. Chen," Barnes said, shaking his hand, "you've saved more American lives than any general or admiral in this war. Your weapon wasn't bullets or bombs. It was mathematics, and it proved deadlier than anything the enemy expected." Philip felt embarrassed by the praise. "I just calculated some angles, General. The gunners did the real work. They trusted the math when everything told them not to. That's leadership, Doctor. You gave them a tool that worked. They used it. Together you changed this war." By 1943, the lead angle technique had spread to every branch of the American military. Navy gunners used it against Japanese aircraft in the Pacific. Anti-aircraft batteries used it against German bombers over American bases. Even tank crews adapted the principles for firing at moving targets. The impact rippled across the entire war. German and Japanese pilots, once confident in their superiority, now approached American forces with caution. The psychological effect was as important as the tactical one. The Allies were no longer passive victims. They were dangerous. Jack Morrison flew his 50th and final mission in March 1943. He had survived when so many others hadn't. He had 21 confirmed kills. He was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. At his medal ceremony, Jack asked if Dr. Chen could attend. The professor had returned to the United States, his work in England complete. But he traveled back for the ceremony. When Jack received his medal, he did something unexpected. He called Philip to the stage. "This medal isn't just mine," Jack said. "It belongs to every gunner who learned to aim ahead, to trust mathematics over instinct. And it belongs to the man who taught us how." Dr. Philip Chen showed us that sometimes the bravest thing isn't facing the enemy. It's facing the truth, even when that truth seems impossible. Philip was overwhelmed. This recognition meant more than any military commendation. These men had trusted him with their lives, and his mathematics had proven worthy of that trust. The war would continue for 2 more years. Millions would die. Cities would burn. But in the skies above Europe and the Pacific, American gunners fought with a new confidence. They aimed at empty air and hit targets that once seemed untouchable. Years later, after the war ended, Jack Morrison visited Philip Chen at Columbia University. The professor had returned to teaching mathematics. He never spoke publicly about his war work. "I wanted to thank you," Jack said simply, "for teaching me to shoot at tomorrow instead of yesterday." Philip smiled. "You already thanked me, Jack, every time you came home alive. That was all the thanks I ever needed." Jack left a small wooden plaque on Philip's desk before he departed. It read, "To the man who taught us to hit what we couldn't see." With gratitude from the gunners of the 8th Air Force, Philip kept that plaque on his desk for the rest of his life. Students sometimes asked about it. He would smile and say it was from old friends. He never told them the full story. The story of how mathematics had changed warfare, how aiming behind the target meant shooting ahead of it, how understanding time and motion had saved thousands of lives. But those who knew, remembered. In military academies around the world, the lead angle technique became standard teaching. Generations of gunners learned to aim not at where targets were, but where they would be and somewhere in the sky. On clear days when the sun glinted off aluminum wings, old veterans like Jack Morrison would look up and remember. Remember the terrifying moments when they first aimed at empty air. Remember the shock when it worked. Remember the professor who taught them that sometimes the hardest thing to hit is what you can't see. The invisible enemy had been defeated, not by bigger guns or more bullets, but by understanding, by mathematics, by the simple truth that in a world moving at 300 miles per hour, aiming at what you see means missing what matters. Philip Chen had given them that truth, and in doing so he had changed the sky forever.